viewers on an episode of American Reef. Who do I have here? Mike Paletta, right? We'll say the famous Mike Paletta, right? How many years do you have in the hobby again?
27.
So now you know why it's the famous Mike Paletta. And I didn't realize it until you said there's the Paletta green, the Paletta blue. That being said, what are we going to do tonight?
We're just going to talk about this tank, which is my sort of deconstruction from my 1,200-gallon tank. I had some family difficulties, so we had to downsize from a 1,200 to a 300. It's only been up about 6 months, and needless to say, it's packed. So in the future, I'm shifting some of these corals into a 75, and I'm hopefully in the future going to show you how to set up a 75 from top to bottom using more or less the latest technology. So hopefully that'll be fun. That's a future installment of this. But in the meantime, we'll go through this tank. It's a relatively simple system, but needless to say, it's pretty packed with fish and corals because, like most of you, I'm a coral addict. So, and once you're in this, it's worse than heroin or cocaine. So
I was going to say, I think you're an addict more than most, right? Because when I look at them, I'm like, wow, the pieces, right? They're beautiful too.
Yeah, and there's lots of small stuff. So that I know I need to thin it, but it's a function of where was I going to put it to. Right. So it's going to another tank.
Right, right. Okay, well, so let's talk about the basics. How big is this tank to begin with?
This is a Marineland 300-gallon off-the-shelf tank that my friend Tony Nista from Marineland got me. It has their custom hood and stand, and then I've made some modifications on it. Obviously, to put the lights in, I had to cut the hood out to put the metal halide lamps in. And then there's LEDs mounted inside instead of using fluorescent actinics, which really brings out the colors a lot more, which will show you when I turn off the metal halides how much this tank glows. And then underneath, it's a modified filtration system with a Ling ecosystem at the front, then a Vertex cone skimmer, and then it also has a calcium reactor and a carbon reactor, and then a big calcium reactor, a GFO reactor.
So let me pause you there. The Ling system, right? Because that's actually one of the reasons why we had talked. I was kind of excited because, remember, I'm starting up that non-photosynthetic. We're only going to go Ling's way, right?
Right.
And so how long has Ling's system been in place, at least?
I've been using Ling system since I met him in 1996, which is amazing that I've known Ling 15 years. Ling was a small boy then. Actually, he's, I think, 3 months older than I am. But when I saw his tank in 1996, at that time, it was the first skimmerless system I had ever seen. And he had the nicest corals and the nicest polyp extension I had seen. And his fish were absolutely spectacularly colored. He had, at that time, the nicest Red Sea Emperor, the nicest Emperor Angel I ever saw. And I've seen dozens of Emperor Angels. None of them really do the fish justice. But when I saw Ling's Emperor Angel in the tank, it was absolutely spectacular in terms of the coloration, the health of it. And what was interesting is he got it basically for free because it had lateral line disease. He put it in his tank with the mud system, and the lateral line healed up. So that more or less convinced me that this was something to look at. So taking things a step further, Ling just believes in the ecosystem. I do an ecosystem in a skimmer because Ling also doesn't generally pack his tanks as much with fish and corals as I do. So because of that, I feed this tank a lot. It actually gets fed between 6 and 8 times a day because there's Anthias and fairy wrasses and small cardinals that all have relatively small stomachs. So by feeding it 6 to 8 times a day, I'm able to keep them all healthy and fat. And basically, it keeps the nitrates and phosphates down. There's been a bunch of papers showing if you feed real small amounts more frequently, or even continuous feeding, you're much more likely to cut down because there isn't any waste. And whenever you just throw in a pinch of food and you watch everything gone, doesn't sink to the bottom, you can understand why there's not a lot of waste with that.
Right. So, okay, so with that much feeding, any water changes?
I do roughly a 40-gallon water change once a month.
Okay, but so it's monthly, it's nothing extravagant.
Yeah, I do 10% once a month. The first week of the month, there's a 40-gallon tank there that's holding live rock. It's usually filled up with fresh salt water. Take out 40 gallons from here, dump in 40 gallons. It takes about 15 minutes to do. Okay, so then Ling system, though, when you look at it from a filtration-wise, and it doesn't, like you said, and this is packed, right? I think so.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
So when you look at it, though, I'm trying to get at, are there any reservations, in other words, ways to implement Ling system?
You can do Ling system any of 3 different ways. You can do it just as an ecosystem by itself, and there's actually people that are doing it now for freshwater tanks. Probably 12 years ago, we were out in California driving around to the different shops, and one of the shops had bred discus in their basement. And they were just starting to use the Ling system, and they had 1 tank of baby discus on the Ling system, and they had 1 tank next to it that weren't on it, and they were from the same batch. The tank on the ecosystem were 2 to 3 times as big and bright adult coloration. The other ones were just like brown discus. And I'm going, those can't. He said, they're from the same brood. I just haven't gotten around to putting it on. That convinced me more than anything how much it affects the coloration. I mean, in this tank, I mean, the wrasses tend to fade over time, but in this tank, they've all kept their vivid coloration. They look like the day I've brought them in. And what else is interesting, most of these fish that are in pairs spawn almost every night or at least every week. I mean, if you come at dusk when the lights are shut down, you can watch everything spawning. I mean, it's pretty nice. I mean, I sit in that chair with the dog and watch it spawn every night.
Well, I was going to say, do you think the general activity, color health, think it's because of the zooplanktons they're kind of inherent in, or is it the minerals in the miracle mud?
I think it's a combination of all of that. It also helps to take the nitrates down. It doesn't really do much for phosphate, but the amount of algae in there and the amount I harvest and throw out does help keep the nitrates down. I mean, I know some people that keep high nitrates and still have good coloration, but when I've done that, everything tended to brown out. And in this tank, pretty much nothing is browned out. So I'm pretty happy with the overall coloration of things.
And now, you've been using the ecosystem for a long time. How many?
Since 1998.
Since 98.
Yeah.
And that's just part of your normal...
That's part of my normal tank. They all have an ecosystem.
So you have eco, skimmer, right?
Right.
Some kind of phosphate remover.
Right.
And then something to put calcium back into it.
Right. There's a big, huge geocalcium reactor. That's the same calcium reactor I had on the 1200. I've just slowed it down, but since I've put it on 2 months ago, the growth has pretty much doubled from what I was doing. I was using the balling method, but because there's so much stuff in here that's growing, I really couldn't keep up with it, and my alkalinity and my calcium were always dropping down. I always kept having to add more, but since I've kicked that on, it's remained a lot more stable. And as we know, stability in a reef tank is crucial toward long-term survivability. Although I got to thin this out, but that'll change the stability, but for the good.
Okay, so before we get into kind of your normal maintenance and all that fun stuff, what's the difference between the balling method and your calcium reactor?
The balling method uses a slow dose controller or pumps that pump in small amounts through the course of the day of a calcium medium, an alkalinity or buffer, and a magnesium. So with this pretty much does the same thing on a continuous basis, just it's not quite as controllable. With the balling method, you can actually control exactly what your levels are by how much you're pumping in. I just couldn't pump in enough to make it worthwhile to do. So this is a little bit rougher way to do it, but because of how fast everything's consuming things, it hasn't been a problem.
And so then balling is synonymous with like the 2-part method, or
it's the 2-part or 3-part.
Okay.
Yeah, the people that go 3-part have the magnesium too.
Okay. Good deal.
Because that's one of the things that up until probably 3 or 4 years ago, people didn't really test was magnesium levels. But a lot of people couldn't get their calcium or their alkalinity levels up, and they can never figure out why. It's because their magnesium levels were like 1,100, 1,000. And that was what was falling off the most in here. And it's amazing how much magnesium you have to dump into a tank to get the levels up to above 1,300. Once they're there, they're relatively stable. But adding it over a couple weeks, because you don't want to dump it all in at once, because with everything here, you cause a problem if you do it fast. But you get impatient going, it's not doing anything.
Let's go. Okay, so for successful kind of aquariums, like you had already said, again, since most of our viewers are kind of the new hobbyists anyway, again, stability is the one thing that you said, right? You kind of define the parameters as far as at least the we'll call it the mechanical filtration. What about the lighting side of it?
The lighting is changing dramatically in that a lot of people are shifting over to LEDs, which is what I'm going to do on the 75. Because this is, well, one, I still have a lot of lamps left, so I'm not ready to change over. And I don't have a big heat problem down here, which is the biggest problem, because it's in the basement. In my old house, I had a air conditioner and a 2-horsepower chiller for that tank. And even with that, in the summertime, it would creep up over 82. Some people think 84 is the max. I try not to let it go much above 82, because then I start to get more bleaching events. So I try to keep it in the wintertime. It's usually 78, 79, goes up to around 80, 81. In the summertime, it's usually 79 to 80, goes up to 81 or 82. All I have to do is blow fans on here, and there's actually a dehumidifier fan in this room, so if either the humidity or the temperature goes up, it literally sucks it all out of the room, and since we're in the basement, it just draws the cool air from the rest of the basement, so it keeps the tank relatively cool.
And now, is that something in general that you would recommend? In other words, instead of doing chillers and all that fun stuff.
Particularly if you're going to LED lights, this is the way to go. The problem you still have is humidity. Most people don't realize how humid it gets, and then you start getting mold hiding in spots. But by drawing out the humidity, I also have a sensor up there that shows me what the temperature and the humidity are.
Yes.
So if it goes up above 35%, it draws out the humidity in this room. So it keeps it cool and dry. Now, as I was saying, in terms of lighting with the LEDs, they're very nice. They're focused, all the light is down, versus these, the lights are 360, so you need the big reflectors. They also produce probably 50, 60, 70% is generated heat versus light. Versus the LEDs, it's like 90%. So you're going to be getting away with a lot lower electricity bills with those lights. They're more expensive up front, and part of the problem with this is right now it would cost me $3,000 to light it with LEDs, but I do have LEDs in here now instead of actinics. And when I crank those on, you'll see how vivid the colors in this tank become.
I was going to say, I know with Brian's tank at the 460, that's what he said when we were doing the math. Within a year's time period, he got his money back.
Yeah.
So it made sense, at least for him.
No, on this tank right now, I did an estimate. It cost me about $120 a month for electricity. If I switch it over to LEDs, it's going to cost me probably about $50. So $70 over 5 years, it will pay for itself.
Right.
It's just because this tank's doing so well right now, I'm real hesitant.
Why break it?
Yeah.
That's right.
Shift everything over and go, uh-oh. No, I don't. And what's interesting, though, is people are finding is you can get major bleaching events with the LEDs. I mean, we're used to thinking of the light coming out of the tank, and they look dull to us because the light's all focused down. And we're also used to thinking of heat in terms of light. With the LEDs, you don't have either of that, so you're left with sort of a whole new feeling of what's going on in the tank.
Right. I
mean, because the other thing is the people are shifting away from totally the T5s and the fluorescents, because the LEDs are a viable alternative to those and produce even more vivid coloration. And let's face it, whenever I started keeping SPSs, we were primarily keeping brown sticks. I actually found a picture of my first Acropora. It looks like a Stuber Acropora, and it is primarily chocolate brown with maybe 3 or 4 millimeters of purple on the tips, and that was the greatest thing. We saw some purple. Yeah. Now we have Oregon torts and everything else. It's every color of the rainbow. I mean, it's amazing what we've done. And what else is nice is that everything in here is primarily a frag or been propagated. So people only propagate colorful corals. So as a result, what's in here is all colorful.
Right. Well, this sounds like a good time for a break. So let's take a break and then we'll come back.
Okay.
Okay, Mike, so we're back now, and last time we talked, we were talking about the LEDs, the lighting, that sort of thing, right?
The technology in general has really improved over the last few years with smaller, more efficient skimmers, more efficient pumps. Everything's now designed to not spend as much electricity, because probably the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of people were driven from the hobby because their electricity bills were getting so ridiculous. I mean, it was as much for their electricity bill as their mortgage payment. And it's easy for us to justify it as men, but most wives weren't real happy with a mortgage payment, the cost of electricity, just for keeping a yucky fish tank going.
Okay, so in general, what do you promote on the lighting side of it?
I like the LEDs and I like the metal halides. I mean, but it all depends on what you want. I mean, the LEDs can do almost as much as the metal halides. I'm still running 400 watt radiums on here. And I'm not really going, I would run 14Ks or 10Ks if I wanted faster growth. But if I had faster growth, I'd have to be in here like a gardener pruning everything all the time. So I'm going more for coloration than I am for growth. So that's why I like the 20Ks. And I like the LEDs instead of the actinics, one from a heat standpoint. When I was running the fluorescent VHO actinics in the summer, I was having a problem with heat. I was having it creep up to 82, 83 every day. I had to run an extra fan. Then I put the LEDs on. I only had to go down to one fan, and I was also having to cut off the lights a lot of times at the end of the day, and they were getting cut short by an hour or two.
Right.
Once I switched over to the LEDs, I didn't have that problem. I'm running Reef Bright LEDs on here, and whenever we switch over or switch off the metal halides and switch on the LEDs, you'll see how much they bring up the coloration and everything.
So now let's talk about the insides of it a little bit. First of all, right, you have a ton of stuff. I take it you everywhere you go, you kind of pick up corals, or how do you do it?
I used to do that. I used to be the guy before 9/11 that used to schlep bags of water onto planes with coral frags, and whenever I was giving talks, part of the deal was I could bring frags home. Now they charge you as much to ship a bag of frags home as it does to cost me. So, and needless to say, there aren't many things that I'm still looking for. There's a few things, obviously, because when you're an addict, you're an addict. But I mean, there's a few really, really good suppliers, but I've probably bought from virtually everybody online. One, just because everybody has something different. I've gotten a lot of pieces from Lou and Victor down at Worldwide Corals. I've gotten things from Ming in Atlantis. Brian at Wet Pets in Pittsburgh gets things from Eye Catching Coral. A lot of Australian stuff came from them. I'm trying to think. I get things from Mike at Sexy Corals. I've gotten a lot of corals virtually from everyone. I mean, and I go to, my son's in California, so when I go out there, I go to the wholesalers because I've known most of those guys since we were all kids. And they'll send me back, you know, a care package of stuff I see. So, and I mean, needless to say, I've gotten some really great stuff because, I mean, seeing out there what they have compared with what's in Pittsburgh, it's kind of disappointing, but thank goodness I didn't live out there because I would have probably have a 2,000-gallon tank and be really poor.
For real. So now, okay, I asked you this before, but I'll ask you so everybody else can hear. As far as the corals itself, right? What are your favorites?
I've always been an acro junkie, which, you know, just because they're to me always something that's growing. It can grow fast. They can change colors in the tank depending on the lighting. I mean, some of these corals look so different in this tank than they did in the 1200. I mean, you wouldn't even know they were the same corals. But I've become a chalice junkie. I got a bunch of stuff recently from Jason Fox, who has the Ultimate Chalice collection. There's so many things I like. There's the odd Australian LPSs. I have a big orange Australomusa. I have Blastomusas. I have some big chalices. I have small chalices. There's a half dozen Australian Scalimias in here. I mean,
it doesn't matter. You like them all.
I like them all. I mean, that's why I keep adding more tanks. Yeah, like I said, all the coral addicts that are out there understand what it's like to just see stuff and be able to get it. I mean, my kids are grown now, so I can pretty much buy what I want, so it's bad.
Bad in one way, good in another.
Oh, and I've also gotten a lot of stuff from the Divers Den. Particularly, I've gotten more weird fish from them. Simply because finding weird fish is more and more difficult because everybody wants them. But one of the main fish that I collect are fairy wrasses, and there's a lineatus, there's a bathyphilius, there's a two rubra squamous, there's a rhomboidalis, and there's also a candy cane hog. So there's a ton of, well, not a ton, but a lot of odd fairy wrasses, and that's why I have to do the feeding regime that I do for them.
And they don't pick on the coral at all, huh?
No, everything in here is pretty much reef safe. I mean, people worry about the flame angels because there's a mated pair of flame angels in here, but even they don't really pick anything.
Now, you know, the one thing we didn't talk about on the external side was the flow, right? So I noticed a lot of flow options, so to speak, right?
Right.
What's your general philosophy on flow?
I always go with the more, the better. And as the corals grow, you tend to need to add more. And I have it blowing in all different directions. I mean, it's all power heads for the most part, just because I don't want, I'm not a firm believer in running a ton of flow through the sump. I mean, I run about 1,200 gallons an hour through the sump. It doesn't look like it, just because I have such big outflows coming up, because I'm not trying to get pressure out of those. But I get most of my flow from within the tank. And, I mean, you could see the anemones blowing and the Aphilias blowing, which gives you an idea of the flow within the tank. It's not the hardcore flow all the time. It changes somewhat randomly. And that's the one thing I want a controller for, is to simply move things around a lot more.
And so, in general, how much roughly gallons per hour of flow do you have? Because I see, 3 of the Vortec, right?
Yeah, 3 of the Vortec, 2 COs and 2 high doors. There's a little over 6,000 gallons an hour in here, if they were all on all the time.
Right. And do you consider that, like, I go back to like the new hobbyists, maybe if they're running LPS, right? Or they have softies, still consider the same amount of flow in those kind of environments?
Yeah, because most of the corals come from relatively high flow. We're not, you get some things from the back lagoons, but even those have water blow over them quickly once or twice a day.
Right.
Because the main thing you're trying to do is keep detritus from settling on things. Because most coral have mechanisms for pulling stuff in. They don't really have a lot of mechanisms for expelling stuff. They rely on the current around them.
Right.
So by having flow, you keep the corals. I mean, another thing is it actually helps keep the fish better. Whenever I used to run low flow, I have a friend who's a anatomist, and one of the things we did was when a fish died, he liked to dissect them.
Right.
And one of the things we found is that when fish didn't have a lot of flow, a lot of them died from fatty livers. Because, I mean, like us, if you don't get any exercise, fat tends to accumulate.
Sure.
And since we always tend to overfeed our fish in general, so by having a lot of flow, the fish are always moving around more and burning up the calories that you're giving them. Because we give them predominantly protein.
And that makes sense. It makes a lot of sense, actually. So lots of flow no matter what.
Yeah.
And now as far as kind of like the online suppliers, right? Is there, like, again, remember the new guy, there are some that are out there that you know for sure, right, that you're going to get something extremely healthy and it'll be easier on the new guy than somebody who maybe has been in the hobby a little bit longer?
Well, Worldwide Corals has sent me the most stuff, and their stuff actually looks exactly like it looks in their pictures,
right?
Which is half the battle, because a lot of people Photoshop their stuff,
right?
And in the picture it looks like it's purple, and you get it and it's brown with a little edge of purple,
right? And
when you're paying high amounts for things, they're good. Diver's Den for Small Foster and Smith used to be better. They started photoshopping things a little bit more, but they still have good, healthy corals, and their fish are spectacular, and you get a 2-week guarantee on them. So if stuff dies,
right.
But I mean, I've had pretty good success with them. I mean, I'm still a firm believer in going in and seeing in a local fish store is a ticket, but there are some very reliable ones. But for high-end stuff, you can look at Sexy Corals, you can look at Cherry Corals, you can look at Atlantis, and they have spectacular stuff.
So my biggest issue with any tank that I've ever had, my hands are in the water too much. And I'm moving this, that, and the other. Do you have that issue? Or
this tank really doesn't require a lot of hands in the water. Usually twice a week I have to stick my hands in for stuff that's fallen down or that's burning something. But for the most part, I use magnets to clean the glass, so I don't have to put my hands in for that. I developed a little feeder for fitting the LPS on the bottom, where it's a funnel on a long tube, and that way I'm not sticking my hands in 100 times with a pair of tweezers to try and feed it.
And I noticed in general, as far as your sand bed, right, goes.
Yep.
Again, relatively little amount of sand bed, not 6 inches or the.
No, I was never a big deep sand fan because just stuff tends to accumulate. So this, I go in and stir it up when I do the water changes. Amazing amount of how much detritus is in there, and by doing that once a month, it's a pretty stable environment.
And when you store it, do you just take a power head kind of thing, or what do you do?
No, actually, I have I got this from Tony Vargas's book. Is that I have a fork on the edge of the hose on a solid clip, and I just go and rake the sand, and as it goes up, it gets siphoned out.
Very good idea. Okay, so you're a new hobbyist. What's the one piece of advice you could give them?
It's something I said 20 years ago, and it still holds true. Nothing good ever happens fast in a reef tank. Only bad stuff happens fast. You don't wake up one morning and your frag is turned into a table the size of a piano. No. But you can have your table that's the size of a piano bleach out overnight.
Right.
So nothing good happens fast, so don't expect things. I was always told that I have no patience, and this hobby is the only thing that has taught me patience, particularly since I grow corals from frags.
Right.
But because I know this tank is just in its early stages. It's only been up for roughly 6 months. So I'm thinning and I'm picking the corals that I like from the frags that I have, and I'll just give them time to grow out. I mean, I obviously took some corals from my old tank that were big colonies that I really liked, but for the most part I took or have bought or have traded a lot of frags, and I'll just let those grow out.
Got it.
The other thing is, and you always hear this, but you really do get what you pay for. The most expensive stuff you spend in a hobby is stuff you replace.
Right.
So if you buy junk because you save $5 on it, and then you have to replace it, you didn't save that $5. Right. So I have learned the hard way: buy the best equipment you can one time, and it's basically there forever. It's like I do a lot of cooking.
Right.
Buy a good set of knives, buy a good set of pots and pans. They last forever. Yeah. It's the same thing here. Buy a good set of lights, buy a good set of pumps, and they last forever. And then when you buy fish and corals, buy good quality, because I've had fish that have lived 20 years.
Right.
I mean, my marine betta is 20 years old. So, I mean, things like that.
Right.
I mean, I look at everything in terms of what it cost me over the length of time that I have it.
Right.
I mean, you may buy a $300 fish. If it only lives 3 months, you paid $100 per month.
Right.
But if it lives 10 years, you only paid $30 per year. Everyone's going, oh, that's not bad.
Right.
So if you keep things and maintain things really well over time, it's not that expensive a hobby, because unlike freshwater, where the fish have a life expectancy of 6 to 12 months or 18 months for most of the fish that we keep, some of these fish, even the simple fish like the green chromis, there's records of them living 12, 14 years. Right. Where you lose most of your stuff is in the initial phase. Right. So learn to acclimate it. I know everyone says have a quarantine tank. Realistically, 10% of the hobbyists have quarantine tanks. Right. I mean, let's be honest. No one wants to have a tank that they don't do anything with. Right. Or they get a quarantine tank and make it into another tank. Right. So, I mean, that's what I did. Right. So I've learned to acclimate the fish. They sit in a plastic box in there. I get good quality so they don't have ick. If I see any kind of problems on them, then I'll set up a quarantine tank really fast, which is just setting up a tank with some live rock in it. I'll drop the salinity down, kill off whatever they have, make sure they're eating, and then introduce them here without stressing them. Okay, so you just mentioned a good point that I never even thought of, meaning that, again, nobody's using, I shouldn't say nobody, but a few people quarantine, right? But what you're doing is you're saying you put basically a tank inside your tank and let them sit, or what do you do that for most of the fish that I see that are I get in that are healthy. Right. But if I get a fish that I see has a problem, I will set up an immediate quarantine tank. Right. I have a 10-gallon tank. I take some live rock out of the sump, stick it in there, take some water out of the tank, put 10 gallons back in the tank, because 10 gallons isn't going to stress a 300-gallon tank. Right. Put a power head, a heater, and a little pump on there. Right. Lower the salinity down that tank gradually, because that kills just about everything. Right. Feed the fish garlic-enhanced food and some other things. Right. Give it a couple weeks to totally heal up. Then scoop it out without stressing it with a net. Sure. Put it in an acclimation chamber. Right. Because particularly in a tank like this, where most of these fish are very aggressive and territorial, I put a new fish in the tank, anything, it's going to get beat. They kill it. It's like the new kid in school coming in the middle of the year. Right. So I let it sit in this box for a week. So it's eating, so the other fish have seen it. Then the day before I'm about to put it in, I put it into a clear box. Right. And only once I see that the fish aren't attacking the box anymore and aren't showing any displays of aggression, then I'll release the fish into the tank. Perfect. And the clear box is actually sitting inside your main display. Yeah, as is I use a black pond box. Yes. Is the acclimation box. Okay, there you go. I mean, the main thing is to get them eating. Because 9 times out of 10, you lose the fish because the other fish are so aggressive. This fish doesn't get a chance to eat, and it starves to death, or it gets so weak they beat the crap out of it. Sure. So by letting it getting acclimated, it's a lot more likely to survive long term. Like I said, once it's in there and it's healthy, they'll live forever. Right. I mean, very rarely do I lose anything. That's such a great idea, though. Like, it's acclimation over weeks or whatever, and you can see it, and with the clear tank inside the tank, everybody's acclimated. They all see it. I mean, perfect. Every place has these little plastic boxes for reptiles or stuff for like $8. Right. You just drill it out, put little drill holes so the water flows through it. Right. I put a piece of PVC pipe so it has a place to hide. Right. And let the fish get used to it. Right. No, perfect. Right. Because again, it's just one of those things, like I said, it's a tank, people want to use it, etc. And so it's just a fact of life that everybody's not quarantining. So if you are, at least you can acclimate accordingly. Yeah. Good idea. Good deal. Let's take a break on that spot, and then we'll come back. Okay.